Emotional manifestations of sexual trauma. And you're already up here, Stacey, so you can go ahead and spill it out.
Well, some of the emotion, the first, trust. That's the first thing, in terms of having to rebuild that. So after it comes to my background in terms of in relationships, I experienced domestic violence. Okay, that was the trauma that I experienced in my past. And so even with that, even with sexual trauma, trust is the very first thing that you have to rebuild, but first within yourself. So you have to rebuild that trust within yourself. And many times, emotionally, what happens is when there's lack of trust, a lot of women will not trust their decisions. They will second guess themselves. They will see when they're in relationships with other people, even if it's not a romantic relationship, but especially with men, right? It can be a platonic situation, it could be a work situation. But what happens is they will actually see men like in terms of having ulterior motive. So they're going to be like, okay, what's going on behind the scenes? So there's actually a lot of mistrust with men. And then how it manifests is because of that lack of trust, which is the first thing emotionally, they then end up attracting emotionally unavailable men that will further propagate the trauma or their belief in their lack of trust. So that would be the first thing I'd say in terms of emotional manifestations is that trust part and second guessing themselves, not trusting themselves, and then how it shows up in their relationships is separation. And then they'll start to feel they're not connected to people. So that's the other thing that they then have to deal with emotionally is it'll have a hard time feeling that connection. So it'll feel like something is missing, but it really comes down to the trust issue from being afraid and fear of connecting.
Thank you. All right, Rachel, what are your thoughts on emotional manifestations of sexual trauma?
So I want to speak to shame. I think there's a very, very long list of, the ways that we are impacted by abuse and trauma emotionally, but I'm just going to center my response around shame. And I think this is just one of the most wounded places that we go to as a result of trauma and assault. We walk away with this feeling that we are now branded. There is now something about us that makes us wrong or different or dirty or broken. We began to have an internal sense of worthlessness, not deserving. And so, the long-term impact of that, seeing ourselves constantly through this lens of shame leads to a lot of those places of separation and disconnection. And how could I trust someone? Like, if I don't even believe and love myself, how could I trust that somebody else would? So picking up where Stacey was speaking as well. And yeah, and so I think that navigating that piece of the healing journey has been just really super critical in my own work and what I get to do, with my clients every day. How do we begin to shift that? Because the other connection here is that when we are in a place of shame, we are always going to be discounting our needs and our desires. So then that loops back into how can we also show up in a sexually healthy way or dynamic or empowered way. And so we don't know how to maybe tap into our needs. We become disconnected. And so these, like, from shame, there are all these other trickle down effects of like the ways we end up becoming limited emotionally. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Dr. Kat, what are some of the physical manifestations of sexual trauma? You're on mute.
Can't hear me, but you can hear the body. So like I was saying earlier, the body is really intelligent. So any of the physical symptoms that we're experiencing is the body's attempt to either trying to process the trauma that it's experienced in the past or trying to protect us. So some of these symptoms can be, we can experience chronic fatigue, we can experience disassociation or disconnection from the body. We might experience muscle tension, which may even lead to painful sex. So that's oftentimes we can see the vaginal muscles want to clench, or again, trying to protect. So that can cause some pain around, or difficulty with arousal in regards to sex. Difficulty with orgasm. So in order to have an orgasm, an orgasm is a contraction and expansion. So in order to experience that contraction, the body has to be relaxed, or at least open enough to be able to have that. There can also be difficulty with sexual desire or arousal as it exists in the body. There might be involuntary shaking or trembling of the body, and that's just the body's natural response to process out any of the stress hormones that have been released in the body. We may even have startle responses. So for me personally, I had sexual trauma from both when I was little and then also in my early 20s, and it manifested in specific body positions where I would have a startle response and like throw my partner off and just freeze. Or I would have a difficult time speaking for what it is that I want. And it was almost like a lump would get stuck in my throat and I couldn't talk or ask for what it is I want, because the whole system just froze and almost like couldn't move through that. So all of these are natural. All of these are, again, the body's responses to take care of us. We need to be mindful not to judge the body or say that it's broken, but it's more of compassion and understanding and slowing down so that we can be with the body instead.
Thank you. Karen, what are some of the physical manifestations?
So let's talk a little bit about what trauma is. So trauma is really an event or a series of events that so overwhelms our nervous system and overwhelms our bodies that our bodies aren't able to metabolize those events and metabolize the emotions around them. And so when I say metabolize, like literally like food, metabolizing it, processing it, and releasing it. So that's really what needs to happen. But instead, when the body is overwhelmed, the nervous system is overwhelmed and can't restore its regulation, can't re-regulate, then all of those emotions and our responses, our trauma responses, fear, that the flight, the fight, freeze, all of those like literally get stuck in our bodies. And so that's what gives rise to all these problems that Kat was referring to, like the physical manifestations that show up in our bodies, because they're now literally in our muscles, in our tissues, even down to a cellular level. So it can show up in so many ways. I mean, you know, Kat listed many of them, but so loss or diminished sense of sensation in our body. So like a numbness in our reproductive organs, our sexual organs, or anywhere in our bodies. You know, Kat referred to our throat. I mean, it can be in our throat chakra, and our voice is like frozen. Physical problems including weight gain, weight loss, eating disorders, digestive problems, asthmatic, you know, kind of breathing symptoms, because we don't breathe, you know, when we're under trauma and under great stress. Pelvic pain, headaches, colitis, and other bowel disorders, fertility issues, like kind of, I mean, like the full range of dis-ease of things, because it's showing in our bodies, like joint problems, because like literally these emotions have become toxic because they're now in our bodies and they were meant to flow through. So, you know, I don't want to spend a whole lot of time, additional time on that, but I want women to understand that they may feel like, oh, well, this isn't connected. But it's like, yes, these are manifestations of the trauma because it's stored in your body. And so now let's move it through.
Awesome. And you're going into the next question now. How about spiritual manifestations of sexual trauma? Talk about that.
Okay, so spiritually shows up in similar ways. So Spiritually is anything that affects our spirit, our soul. And so sexual trauma goes to the soul of who a woman is. And men experience trauma too, sexual trauma, but this is foreign about women. So, you know, it goes to the heart and that the very soul and spirit of who a woman is. And so what can happen is there's like a breaking off or a breaking away almost of the soul or the spirit from the woman. And so she might experience that. So kind of from a shamanistic perspective, it's viewed as like soul loss, soul wounding. And so the soul has been stolen or has gone into hiding for protection. And so it's really about restoring and reconnecting the soul, like reintegrating the soul back to the person. And so it might manifest as like kind of your soul's MIA, you know, missing in action, like a drifty sense. It can manifest as depression, lack of motivation, but also perfectionism and a need for control, like maintaining control over everything, because that soul contains part of our life, what we call our life force energy. You know, it's who we are and what empowers us. So all that powerlessness, all that sense of being unworthy, unlovable, because that's now all in our body and our soul has now disconnected. And so it's bringing it back. And when I talked earlier about like coming back home, it's like welcoming our soul, like our very soul, that part of our soul that's left during this trauma, welcoming that part of us back home so that now we're moving through life in a whole way, as whole people.
Thank you. Allie, same question. What are some of the spiritual manifestations of sexual trauma?
That was good. That was good, Karen. So when I think of the spiritual, everything about us is spiritual, right? So the trees, the grass, everything is the divine. And that's just God, goddess, universe, source, whatever you want to call it. So when we experience trauma and we don't move through the process of shifting it, metabolizing it, healing it, then we are literally disconnected from source. And then that just makes everything so much harder, right? Because if we can't look in ourselves and say that we are the divine, we are amazing, regardless of what has happened to us and around us, then that disconnects us on a level that's really hard to flourish. And so spiritually, when we have a story about ourselves that isn't the truth, right? So we have the truth and we have beliefs. Belief is a story that we created about ourselves because of something that we experienced. The truth is that we are the divine. We are energy. We are source. We are all those things. And so it's really hard to tap into that truth when you've experienced something that's traumatizing. And so when we can't tap into that truth, the truth to me is like plugging into a source, right? And that gives us all of our light, all of our inner knowing, everything that we are on a spiritual realm. And so when we don't access that, then it's just part of us, right? That's moving through our world, part of us that's showing up, part of us that is acknowledging the sunshine or the trees or the people around us. So we're not in our entirety when it comes to disconnecting from who we are because of that experience. So it's, I mean, we are spiritual beings in a human body. So first and foremost, that's who we are. And then not having that fullness about ourselves gives us a big hit on everything else that we connect with or don't connect with.
Thank you. One more for you, Allie. What's the difference between hyper and hyposexuality?
Hyper and hyposexuality. So hypersexuality is just a lot. So we use, we look for sex in everything, right? To fulfill us. So it can be said too that we sexualize things around us. We sexualize relationships. We feel like sex is how we are accepted, even if we don't want to. Like this is just a way for us to feel okay with ourselves. So when we think of the sacral chakra, which is right below the belly button, that's relationships, creativity, sexuality. Then there's an imbalance in that chakra. And so when I studied in India, my teacher was telling me that the sacral chakra is our mother. So how we see our mother is actually our sacral chakra. So then when we look at our sacral chakra and how we show up in relationships and it's in balance to a place where that's what we're focusing on, right? That's what we're focusing on, whether it's something that we're trying to move through with our mother, trying to move through with trauma, then we're going over the top with sexuality, right? Everything is sexuality. This is how I get what I want. This is how I interact with people. It's just very sexual. Hypo is the opposite, so not sexual. And so then when we think of the sacral chakra and we think of it just like an energy wheel, and then all that energy, right, we're protecting it, we're closing it down, then we're not interested, right? We're shutting down our creativity, our connection to people and relationships. So everything that we do is sexual. We use sexual energy, right? So when we comb our hair, when we talk, when we get dressed, when we do all the things, we are accessing sexual energy because we are creating a movement, a sound. And so to find balance in hyper and hypo is to see sexual energy as something different, right? To run it. So it's good to know what is hyper, what's hypo, but then how do you find the balance? And that is just, and I'll do that on my talk too, is understanding that this is what it is and then how to run it in the body and start to change the stories. So that was a really long roundabout way to answer that question.
Thank you, Allie. How about, can we hear from you, Dr. Kat?
Yes, you can. That was so, yeah, that was so beautifully said, Allie. So I see hypersexuality as compulsive sexual behavior or an excessive preoccupation of sexual fantasies or urges or behaviors. And to the point where, and this is, I think this is really important to differentiate, to the point where it's difficult to control. It's compulsive. It causes us distress, or it causes, it negatively affects our job or our health or our relationships or another part of our life. Because like Ali was saying, it's healthy to be connected with our sexuality, but if we use it to the excess to where it's causing a disruption in things, or we're using it to hide and protect in our sexuality, because if we think of sexual energy, it can also be very hallucinogenic. It's very euphoric. It's very exciting. It's thrilling. And it can also cause us to be distracted from what might be lying underneath. So we might be using it as a protective mechanism to avoid the vulnerable and emotions that are alive in our body that may not be integrated in our system or aware of. And then hyposexuality is the low desire, the low or no desires. So sometimes this manifests as avoidance, or can be completely cut off from our sexual energy. Or it might just be a lack of interest in it and desire to connect with that part of us.
Thank you. How does sexual assault impact a person's sexuality, Dr. Kat?
So on many different levels. So if we think of sexuality as more than just the act of sex, it's really how we identify ourselves in this world, and it's how we identify with our attractions as well. So sexual assault impacts our internal working model around what it means for us to be sexual beings, or how we relate to other people, or even sometimes our attraction towards certain people. So we may be turned off completely from a specific gender or a specific expression of a person because it reminds us, it triggers that part in our brain that says that there's this cue is dangerous, or this particular person is dangerous. It may even activate a specific feeling in our body. So like the flutter and the buzz of arousal that comes up into the body may activate a danger cue. So the body may shut down, or it may disconnect or quiet that buzz. It can also cause confusion or avoidance of anything that is sexual related content, situations. That's why we oftentimes will put, or somebody who is trauma informed might put at the beginning, trigger warning before they start talking about something sexual related, because then somebody gets to choose whether or not they want to engage with that feeling in their body yet, whether they're ready for that yet. So it can really skew the feeling of safety that hopefully we can, that we may or may not have around sexuality and the feeling of it. Sexuality, I see sexuality as equivalent to our life force energy, which is our vibrancy, our ability to be alive in this world. So if our sexuality has been impacted by assault, then that also impacts our ability to be vibrant in the world.
Thank you. This next question is for Karen. What are the steps to moving out of the struggle?
So there's so many modalities and so many approaches to how we do that, how we move out of the struggle. But the struggle really, like our greatest suffering really comes from our disconnection from ourselves, from our inner selves, from our bodies. And then that disconnects us from life. It says, as Dr. Kat said, like we're literally disconnected from our own life force energy. We're disconnected from life. And so the steps are restoration of that. So restoration of our connection with ourselves. So we work with several ways to achieve that. So we work with meditation to bring us back into an awareness, a presence in our own bodies. So when I say meditation, I'm talking about also just breath, learning how to breathe again, using forms of breath work that help to regulate our vagus nerve, so that we're in terms of our nervous system. So on a neurobiological level, we're brought into a place of safety and a sense of safety and a sense of peace in our own bodies. We work with movement. So movement, is fun. Dancing is fun, moving our hips, moving our pelvises is fun, but it also moves that energy, when we talked about that energy that hasn't processed through those emotions, it's able to, in a very fun, light way, move that energy through. I mean, when you think about like indigenous cultures, whether it's the hula, whether it's authentic twerking, whether it's the salsa, belly dancing, like in indigenous cultures, it's like always that hip movement, that pelvic movement, which moves that energy, that toxic energy out of the pelvis. So using movement to achieve those things, connection practices to reconnect with ourselves and connect with our primary partner and other people in our lives, and how to communicate our own needs, our own desires, like what we're feeling, what we're needing, and how to communicate that to our partners. And then pleasure is medicine. So using pleasure as medicine, because we have a divine right to pleasure. And so when someone's been physically assaulted and sexually assaulted, that whole concept of pleasure becomes totally distorted. And we're in a culture where we talk about pleasure, but we have this like really kind of weird relationship with pleasure. It's like pleasure is something you have after you've, over the weekend, after you've busted your behind for 5 days, or after you eat your vegetables, you can have your dessert. So it's this sort of like add-on that you have to deserve, as opposed to like you have a divine God-given right to pleasure, and it heals your body. When we talked about what happens in the body during pleasure, all these chemicals that heal our bodies, if we didn't have a divine right to pleasure, we wouldn't have been created in that way. We'd be created to thrive on cortisol and adrenaline and all those stress chemicals. So it's like using all those components to bring us, move us away from that struggle, that suffering, and bring us back into connection to ourselves and to our own souls and our own bodies.
Thank you. Stacey, same question. The steps to moving out of the struggle.
Well, it's a combination of what has already been shared, and I wanted to add this from perspective. So in terms of moving out of that struggle, there's actually like 3 steps. So the first thing is around healing the trauma. But here's one of the things I want you to throw in the mix with that. Part of healing the trauma is to really understand your nature versus nurture. So the traumatic event is the nurture. That's the conditioning, the environment, the programming, the incident that occurred. And many times after sexual trauma, we define ourselves by that trauma. And then that's how we move forward into life. So one of the things about healing that is separating who you are, who you truly are, which is your nature, from the event that happened to you, which was the nurture or the environment. So first of all, it's like pulling those apart. You are not the trauma. And so it's really connecting you back to yourself and who you truly are, which is your nature. And then especially as this, your nature as a woman is also very, very important. So that's like the first thing. And then the second thing I would say to that is, once, you know, in terms of working through the healing of the trauma, then really defining what is it that you want, right? Just like we talked about earlier, it's like really defining what you want, because then that gives you, you know, then what to move forward to in terms of then integrating it into your life. Because if you don't know what you want, you don't know what to integrate back into your life. So, and that would be the last part, is integrating it back. So this is why, you know, when I work with sex therapists, a lot of the sex therapists, they'll deal with the trauma. And then once the trauma is healed, they'll pass them, you know, the client on to me, because then I teach them how to integrate back into society in terms of your sexual expression, in terms of your body language, and feeling good and healthy and joyful and yummy with your body, because that is your God-given right, or your goddess-given right in which to do that. So it really is like a team effort, and where we're all playing a role. But here's one of the other things I want to share with you, because it's been touched on how to get clear. So the first thing I want you to think about is communication, is really talking, being comfortable with talking about what you're experiencing. And this goes into the shame that I think Rachel had talked about before. It's one of those things is talking about your experience and talking about how you are working through that to thrive is also part of your healing, right? That's also part of the healing, so you don't have to be ashamed. And this is how you also bring power to your voice. So communication is also the key to connection. And so when you are communicating with your partner or for other people, that is when you're going to feel more connected, and you don't feel isolated like you're dealing with this by yourself, because you're not. And so communication is the key to connection. And when there's connection, there's intimacy. And intimacy is different from sex. They're not the same. Intimacy is being able to see into a person and allowing that person to see into you. And so it's really authentic, and it's a really vulnerable state. And when you get there, trust is there, right? That's what's needed for intimacy. And then after the intimacy, that is where the commitment is. However you define the commitment is for yourself. And so that is like a process that you can use to work through the struggle. So it's healing the trauma, defining what you want, and then integrating back into society in a way that is healing for your heart, your mind, and your body.